This map shows the strategic situation in June 1863. Before I get into it, I'd like you to take a look down at the bottom where you see the names of three theaters of war into which the Civil War is conventionally divided. The first and the least important of the three is what's called the Trans-Mississippi Theater, and incorporates everything west of the Mississippi River. The next theater is the Western Theater, which is basically everything between the Mississippi River on the west to the Appalachian Mountains on the eastern side. It's the largest of the three theaters, and ultimately, it is the decisive theater where the campaigns and battles that won the Civil War on the part of the Union were actually fought. The third theater is what's called the Eastern Theater. It consists mostly of Virginia, with an occasional extension into Maryland and even into southern Pennsylvania. For many years, this Eastern Theater was the one that got by far the most play, and that's because Robert E. Lee and other famous generals were fought there. The two best known and largest armies, the Army of the Potomac on the part of the Union and the Army of Northern Virginia on the part of the Confederacy, fought back and forth there. And it was a kind of a cockpit where scarcely 100 miles intervened between Washington, D.C., the Union capital, and the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. So because of these reasons and because of the proximity of the Eastern Theater to large population centers, particularly in the North, the Eastern Theater got the lion's share of attention during the war and in the decades afterward. One other reason that the Eastern Theater was important was because of the number of foreign embassies that were located in Washington, D.C., from which Great Britain and France in particular, but also other European powers and indeed powers from all over the world. This was their main vantage point by which to look at the Civil War and by which to get a sense of which side was winning and who had the advantage, and therefore who you might want to ultimately intervene on behalf of or provide support for, and so on. But to get to the actual situation in June of 1863, you'll see top right that in Virginia you have a stalemate. And this is a stalemate that has so far worked to the benefit of the Confederates. Confederates under Robert E. Lee have been successful in fending off the Federals in a number of battles. The 7 Days battles, a campaign called Second Manassas that occurs in August of 1862, the Maryland campaign culminating in the Battle of Antietam that occurs in September of 1862, a disastrous offensive battle on the part of the Federals that comes to a near debacle in December of 1862 in the Battle of Fredericksburg. And then in May of 1863, the Army of the Potomac inflicts a surprising defeat on a Federal army that at the time of the battle outnumbers the Confederate army by almost 2-1. That's called the Battle of Chancellorsville. And this sets the conditions where Lee has fought the Federals to a standstill in Northern Virginia. And the question now is, what to do next. What has happened so far in the rest of the Western Theater has been that in Tennessee, the Federals have gradually occupied the western part of Tennessee and the central parts of Tennessee. So essentially, the western part of Tennessee all the way down to Memphis, and the central part of Tennessee, including Nashville, but also including much of the rest of the state. So only eastern Tennessee remains in Confederate hands. And then finally, along the Mississippi River Valley, the Federals at this point have control of the entire river except a major fortress at Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is the one we're going to be looking at, and then a lesser fortress downstream a bit called Port Hudson, but it's Vicksburg that we're going to be focused on. Now, in June of 1863, a Union Army under Ulysses S. Grant has conducted a masterful campaign that has resulted in pushing the Confederates into the fortification lines at Vicksburg and have clamped a siege on Vicksburg that in the fullness of time is going to result in the defeat and the surrender of Vicksburg if assistance cannot be sent to relieve the garrison in Vicksburg. In Richmond, then, in the latter part of May, there are a couple of conferences that occur that involve President Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and some key Confederate civilian leaders and also a couple of Confederate generals, and they meet in Richmond to discuss what to do with the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's army. One school of thought is that Lee should remain on the defensive in Northern Virginia, and send the bulk of his army westward to relieve the garrison at Vicksburg, Mississippi. This has points in its favor, but Lee very much disagrees with this option. He basically says, "Hey, look, it's going to be the summer months, and that's a bad time to be transferring troops to a new situation. But more than that, it's going to take a long time to transfer such a large body of troops by railroad, and by the time that they get there, it's going to be too late for them to influence the situation." So those are Lee's two main reasons for opposing a transfer to Vicksburg. The main one being the second one, that they'll arrive too late. But then the third reason, in a way, that Lee opposes a transfer to Vicksburg is because he has another idea of his own, which is to use his entire army and reinforce it to the extent that's possible, and then launch an offensive that will carry the army through Maryland and on up into Pennsylvania. And his hope, ideally, is to win a decisive victory on Northern soil. And oftentimes this decisive victory is portrayed as destroying the Union Army outright. Regardless of whether Lee thought that was possible or not, it just simply was beyond the capability of the Army of Northern Virginia. For that matter, any Civil War army. It was very, very seldom that one Civil War army could actually destroy the other. However, a major Confederate victory on Northern soil at this particular time would have had profound political repercussions in the North. The Northern civilians were beginning to get tired of the war. It was a stalemate. They could see no end in sight. There were two major gubernatorial races underway in 1863. One of them was in Ohio, the other one in Pennsylvania itself, and they pitted Peace Democrat candidates against the Republican candidate. And so a Confederate victory on Northern soil would do a lot to provide an advantage to the Peace Democrats in Ohio and Pennsylvania, because it would serve as ammunition to say that, hey, look, this war is going nowhere. It's a stalemate. All it's doing is killing lots and lots of Americans. It's time to find another resolution besides this continued bloody and indecisive conflict. This map shows the Gettysburg campaign because Lee won. He had Jefferson Davis' entire confidence, and so when he says, "I want to invade Pennsylvania," he gets his way. And if you look at this map, you'll see in gray the way that Lee's army advances first to the west and then northward, and it advances northward down the Shenandoah Valley, and that places the Blue Ridge Mountains between him and the Union Army, and all he needs to hold then are the gaps, the mountain passes in the Blue Ridge Mountains to prevent the Union Army from getting over there and attacking him. So what the Union Army has to do instead is to march northward, east of the mountains, and try to keep pace with Lee's army. Excuse me, and hope to catch up with Lee's army and fight it somewhere in Maryland or in Pennsylvania. Neither side knows where this battle is going to take place. They just expect that a battle is going to take place at some point. Now, Lee depends on intelligence, on knowledge of where the Union Army is. He depends upon his cavalry commander, a guy named General Jeb Stuart. And Stuart, instead of staying with Lee's army, is given an option. His mission is to go into Pennsylvania and take care of the right flank of one of the Union corps, the one that's headed toward Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And he thinks that he can do this by moving east of the Union Army and get ahead of it and get into his position that way. He's ridden around the Federal Army twice before in previous campaigns. He thinks he can do it again this time. In fact, he can't. And he is out of position so that while Stuart, knows the location of the Union Army as it's moving northward, he cannot get information. He cannot convey the intelligence. He cannot convey the information about where the Union Army is to Robert E. Lee. And what happens is that on June 28th, Lee discovers, almost by accident, actually he discovers it through a spy who comes into his encampments. He discovers that the Union Army is much farther north than he expects it to have been. And at that point, Lee's army is spread out over about an 80-mile swath of territory between Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which you can see quite easily in the northeast part of the map, and then all the way to Chambersburg. And Chambersburg is smaller, but it's to the west and a little bit south of Harrisburg. So Lee's army is spread out across 80 miles. And what that means is his army needs to concentrate very rapidly in order to fight the Union Army without being at a disastrous disadvantage by the Union Army being able to attack first one portion and then another portion and a third portion. The place where Lee decides to concentrate is the town of Gettysburg in southern Pennsylvania, and you can see that the Union Army is also headed toward Gettysburg, and so that is where the fighting begins on July 1st, 1863. The map that you're looking at is a detail from the Gettysburg cyclorama, and it shows the climax of Pickett's charge against the center of the Union line on July 3rd, the third day of this 3-day battle of Gettysburg. Obviously, I'm not going to go into the details of the first two days. The fact of the matter is, on July 1st, Lee's army really does quite well and pushes the Union Army back through the town of Gettysburg and obtains positions from which Lee thinks he can strike against the Union Army advantageously the next day. The next day, July 2nd, he does attack. His forces are stopped short of their objectives, but get close enough to their objectives to suggest that a renewed attack on the 3rd will achieve the decisive victory that Lee is seeking. So that results in Pickett's charge, this major frontal attack on July 3rd that meets with defeat. And on July 4th, Independence Day, Lee begins his retreat back into Virginia. Now, if you look at this map, you'll see that it shows the situation between July 5th and July 14th. And what goes on here is that Lee withdraws toward the Potomac River at a town called Williamsport, expecting to cross the Potomac back into Virginia quite promptly. The Union Army of the Potomac, it's under the command of a guy named George Gordon Meade, pursues but cautiously. After all, it's been a destructive battle for both sides. Both sides have had heavy casualties. The last thing that Meade wants to do is to run into a larger portion of Lee's army under disadvantageous circumstances. So he's cautious as he pursues Lee. Now, Lee, when he gets to Williamsport, has a problem. The problem is that heavy rains upstream from the Potomac River have resulted in the Potomac River being too high for the Confederate Army to ford, to cross, by way of finding shallow points in the river, getting across that way. And Union cavalry has destroyed the one bridge, permanent bridge that was there. So what Lee has to do is to construct field fortifications and entrench his position at Williamsburg and wait for the waters to go down. In the meantime, Meade's army arrives in that area, and Meade and his generals contemplate an attack on those Confederate entrenchments. And the fact of the matter is, those entrenchments are very daunting in appearance and in reality, and so they delay the attack. And then on July 14th, they plan to make the attack, but it turns out that Lee has finally withdrawn overnight. The river has fallen to some degree. Lee has been able to create pontoon bridges for his artillery to cross and supply wagons and so on. And then his infantry has been able to ford the Potomac River through chest-high water and make it to the other side. Notwithstanding Meade's victory at Gettysburg, the first unequivocal victory, major victory that the Union has achieved over Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, President Abraham Lincoln is really upset with Meade for letting Lee's army get away. The reason being that far away in Vicksburg, another Union army, this one under Ulysses S. Grant, has succeeded in besieging Vicksburg, which, spoiler alert, surrenders on July 4th, 1863. And so Lincoln's feeling is, hey, if you had destroyed Lee's army, that in combination with the destruction of the Confederate army at Vicksburg would have substantially ended the war, but you blew it. And although Lincoln writes a letter to Meade to this effect, he doesn't send it. Nevertheless, Meade, gets word indirectly that this is how Lincoln feels. And of course, he's pretty bitter about it because he's done a better job than anybody else and is getting no credit for it. Now, I want you to take a look at Vicksburg, Mississippi, and the surrounding terrain. This is a 19th century map, but you can see what's going on. Obviously, you can see Vicksburg pretty easily, and you can see that there are bluffs at Vicksburg that are 300 feet high, and that means that the cannon at Vicksburg that overlooked the Mississippi River, would make it next to impossible for any Union steamboats or gunboats or whatever to get past Vicksburg without being destroyed. So Ulysses S. Grant's army arrives in this area in the winter of 1863. So starting in late December 62 and then on into January, February, and March of 1863, and tries a variety of maneuvers aimed at getting at Vicksburg, which is very difficult to attack from the land side. If you notice, what's north of Vicksburg is a large swampy area called the Yazoo River Delta. And so that makes it very difficult to make an overland advance against Vicksburg. Grant has already tried another overland advance using the railroad that leads down from Tennessee into Mississippi. That railroad is cut and his supply line destroyed by Confederate cavalry. He doesn't want to try that again. And so after various efforts to get past Vicksburg, including attempting to dig a canal around at the base of the bend that leads to Vicksburg, if you look at the bottom center of the map, you can see that. Grant decides to on one of the most daring campaigns of the war, one of the most daring campaign plans, and it's this. In April of 1863, a Union force of gunboats under the command of a guy named David Dixon Porter. Porter and Grant work very closely together. These gunboats slip past the cannon at Vicksburg at night and manage to surprise the Confederates and manage to get past with really no losses at all. It's really quite remarkable. They link up with Grant's army, which is marched on the Louisiana side of the Mississippi River as far as an area called a town called Bruinsburg. And if you look at the very bottom on the left-hand side by the river, you'll see Bruinsburg. Then what happens is Grant cuts loose from his supply lines and has his army live off the countryside as it moves eastward toward Jackson, Mississippi, the capital of the state. And this surprises the Confederate Army commander, a guy named John C. Pemberton. He's not terribly important to know about. Pemberton, first of all, doesn't expect Grant to be able to get to the eastern side at all. And when he does, he expects Grant to march northward toward Vicksburg. So Grant marching eastward to Jackson surprises him. Grant destroys the railroads at Jackson, which cuts Vicksburg off from easy reinforcement by other Confederates, and then marches westward, wins a couple of other battles, and then clamps a siege on Vicksburg that lasts for 47 days. From the middle of May until July 4th of 1863. On the left, you see the town of Vicksburg and the Confederate entrenchments in red, and then the Union entrenchments in blue. And then you also see arrows where Grant made two attempts to assault the Confederate fortifications and gain an early victory. Isn't able to do this, so clamps a siege. And the siege again ends in the Confederate surrender on July 4th, 1863. The painting on the right depicts what this siege was like for civilians, because Vicksburg is under bombardment throughout, and so that's a frightening experience for the civilians. That's an unexploded shell that the two civilians and then the Confederate soldiers sort of recoiling from. Things get to the point by the middle of the siege where all the regular foodstuffs have been eaten up, and the Confederate civilians, the Southern civilians, are reduced to eating rats and things like of that nature. So it's really quite a severe siege from a Confederate point of view. But again, this ultimate victory at Vicksburg, in combination with the Battle of Gettysburg, has come a long way toward creating a military turning point in the struggle. The third campaign that's decisive in 1863 is the Chattanooga campaign, and this really consists of two campaigns, Chickamauga and Chattanooga campaigns. I'm not going to talk about the Battle of Chickamauga. It's just one detail that we don't need to worry about in a course at this particular level. But Chattanooga is critical, and you can see on this map just what makes it critical. It is a railroad center where three major railroads converge, including the railroad that leads into the heartland of the Confederacy. So what you can see in blue, or the blue squares, are the major cities in the South, and then also in Washington, that the Federals already control. Then if you look at Chattanooga, once you get past Chattanooga, you've also gotten past the Appalachian Mountains by and large. And what comes next is Atlanta. And then from Atlanta, you have access potentially to Montgomery, Alabama, Mobile, Alabama, Charleston, South Carolina, for that matter, Savannah, Georgia, and so on. So Chattanooga is of critical importance to the Confederacy and to the Union if it wants to get into the Confederate heartland and have its best shot at winning the war. This Battle of Chattanooga occurs in the latter part of November 1863. It's a really dramatic battle. It'd be nice to sort of take some time to discuss it in detail, but the result is a Union victory that sets up an advantageous situation for the Union going into the critical campaigns of 1864. So I forgot to put to do the little clicky things, but the important thing is the Union Army breaking the siege in the Battle of Chattanooga and gaining a victory in November 1863. Okay, fine. Now, the results of the campaigns of 1863. First, Lee's second major offensive, strategic offensive, the first one ends in the Battle of Antietam. The second major offensive is turned back at Gettysburg. The capture of Vicksburg places the Mississippi River entirely in Union hands, which means that northern shipping can go all the way down to New Orleans and into the Gulf of Mexico. The same as had been the case before the Civil War. This is a major economic as well as military victory for the Union. The capture and control of Chattanooga opens up the Confederate heartland to further Union offensives. And then together, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga form the war's military turning point. And again, I want to emphasize that overall, it is the Emancipation Proclamation that is the war's true turning point overall, because it turns a limited war to restore the Union and to defeat the Confederate government into an all-out, remorseless revolutionary struggle designed to overthrow, really, the political, social, and economic order in the South, and then to have significant second and third order effects in the North as well. But militarily, it's Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. Because of his great victories at Vicksburg and at Chattanooga, Grant's in charge of the offensive at Chattanooga as well. In early 1864, February of 1864, Ulysses S. Grant is placed in overall command of the Union armies. And that's an important development because Grant, for the first time, imposes control over all the Union armies and makes them work together in harness. So launching offensives in a coordinated kind of way and simultaneously. So Grant's appointment to the job of General-in-Chief is in itself an important strategic development. But, and I'll end this lecture on this note, Confederate military strength going into 1864 is still powerful. Northern civilians are still getting tired of the war, notwithstanding the fact, by the way, that in Ohio and in Pennsylvania, it is the Republican candidates who do, in both cases, get the governor's seat. There is a lot of political opposition to emancipation and the draft. Most Democrats regard the inclusion of emancipation as one of the Union war efforts. War aims as a kind of bait and switch thing. They support a war to restore the Union, but they didn't sign on to fight a war for emancipation. And then conscription is unpopular really throughout, particularly among Democrats, but even Republicans aren't wild about the military draft. And there is a presidential election upcoming in 1864. And whether the Union war effort is going to continue after the presidential election is a function of whether Abraham Lincoln gets reelected or not. And that issue is very much in doubt as 1864 begins.